There are relationships that are not meant to be lived, but revealed. They are not simple love stories, they are mirrors, deep reflections of parts of ourselves we'd rather keep hidden. When a connection arises with someone emotionally unavailable, what appears to be a romantic disappointment is actually a meeting with the unconscious. She met him, and something stirred within her. He was reserved, calm, yet impenetrable. He didn't hurt with words, but his distance cut deeper than any offense. And although others advised her to let him go, to find someone more emotionally available, she couldn't, because he wasn't just himself, he was a symbol, a trigger. Who was this woman, a conscious, awakened woman with years of inner growth, capable of deep conversations and open-hearted love? But something in her still responded with anxiety to his coldness. Why? Because this story wasn't about him. It was about her, about an unintegrated part of herself, an inner child still yearning to be validated by someone who couldn't truly see her. From Carl Jung's psychology, we understand that these bonds awaken projections, parts of our unconscious that we unknowingly project onto others. This emotionally unavailable man was the perfect reflection of an ancestral wound, the need for conditional love, the constant search to be enough to be chosen. What if he wasn't meant to love her, but to reveal her? She could have fallen into the trap of drama, of emotional chasing, but she didn't. Instead, she chose to observe herself. Every reaction, every emptiness, every longing. And in that conscious observation, she found a profound truth. This wasn't about fixing the relationship, but healing the root. This video is not a guide to win over a cold man. It is an exploration of how a high-value woman becomes the alchemist of her inner life, how she transforms pain into wisdom, need into autonomy, and waiting into self-choice. And if true love is not begged for, but sustained from within, stay. Because this is not a romantic story, it is a story of deep awakening. A relationship with a cold man is not just a painful experience, it is a psychic revelation. Carl Jung said that everything that is not made conscious appears in our lives as fate. And so, without knowing it, this woman hadn't attracted that man, she had attracted an image, the image of a part of her own shadow. The shadow, in Jungian psychology, represents all that we have repressed, denied or failed to integrate. And intimate relationships are the perfect ground for that shadow to activate. In this case, the man's coldness was not just a lack of affection, it was a trigger that opened the floodgates of her unconscious. She felt anxious when he didn't respond. Her mind filled with obsessive thoughts. Did I say something wrong? Am I being too intense? What if he's no longer interested? But instead of acting on impulse, she asked herself, what part of me is being touched by this silence? And she found the answer. That silence echoed old memories of exclusion, of feeling unseen, of having to try hard to deserve attention. It wasn't the first time she'd felt this. It was just that now the intensity of the connection had amplified it. Jung also speaks to us of projection, the unconscious act of placing our qualities, needs, or wounds onto another. In this case, she wasn't just projecting her need for love, she was projecting her own undeveloped masculine energy. She saw in him the strength, direction, and emotional independence she had not yet learned to embody within herself. And that's why it hurt so deeply, because instead of seeing him as a limited human being, she saw him as an ideal, as a potential yet to be discovered, as a rough diamond that, given enough love, could shine. This is one of the most common traps, falling in love not with the other person, but with the idea of who they could be, and in that illusion, even a high-value woman can lose herself if she's not conscious. But she began to awaken. She started to understand that the connection was not a mistake. It was a mirror. He wasn't there to be saved, but to teach her something crucial. That what she longed for in him was not hers by right. It was a reflection of what she had yet to awaken within herself. And upon seeing it with this new clarity, she stopped expecting him to fill her emptiness. This is one of Jung's deepest teachings. Everything we seek outside is actually an invitation to look within. That need for closeness wasn't wrong, but it was incomplete. She couldn't depend on someone else choosing her to feel worthy. That was an unconscious way of giving away her power. Thus, the relationship began to lose its romantic tone and took on a sacred one. Each of his silences became a call inward. Each rejection was an opportunity to look at herself with honesty. Each frustrated expectation, a chance to dismantle inherited beliefs that kept her trapped in the idea of not being enough. With this new understanding, the dynamic changed, not because he changed, but because she stopped reacting the way she used to. She allowed herself to feel the pain, but didn't dramatize it. She noticed her impulses to insist, but didn't let herself be carried away by them. She recognized the wound, but didn't hand over the wheel. She understood that being with someone emotionally closed off was not a coincidence, but a profound lesson, an initiatory experience in which the true protagonist wasn't the other, but her own consciousness. It was no longer about repairing the bond, but about deactivating the internal pattern that had led her there. She even realized that many times she had confused intensity with connection, that she had tolerated emotional absences disguised as mystery, that she had called love a constant struggle for attention. That honesty with herself is what set her free, because deep down, what she was really searching for wasn't that man, but a reconnection with her own worth, a validation not born from another's desire, but from an inner certainty. With that clarity, a new strength began to emerge within her. Not a loud strength, but a serene one, not rebellion, but firmness, and she understood something transformative. That man wasn't cold to punish her, but to point out the corners of her inner world that still needed warmth. The other's disinterest ceased to be a judgment and became a sign that the time had come to stop begging and start choosing. Most people, when they feel ignored or undervalued, quickly fall into the victim role. He doesn't love me, he doesn't see me, what did I do wrong? But not her. This high-value woman understood that entering the game of emotional drama was just another subtle way of giving away her power. So she chose something different, not to react, not out of repression, but from lucid observation. Every time he pulled away, she breathed and returned to herself. She didn't send impulsive messages, didn't demand explanations, didn't seek instant validation. Instead, she asked herself, what part of me wants to run after someone who is walking away? What emotional void is speaking when I want to force a response? In those pauses, in that sacred space between stimulus and reaction, a deep transformation began to unfold. She discovered that she wasn't fighting against him, but against her own feeling of inadequacy. That the real conflict wasn't with the other, but with the inner voice that whispered, if he doesn't respond, it's because you're not enough. And instead of silencing that voice, she chose something braver. To listen to it, to sit with it, to understand where it came from. It was the voice of a little girl who had learned that love must be earned, that affection is a reward, not a right, that she had to be good, quiet, pleasing, useful, to be seen. That same belief, now as an adult, was still alive in her emotional system, only now more sophisticated, stronger, more dangerous. But at this point, she chose differently. She rejected the idea that she had to convince someone to be loved. She rejected the belief that another's coldness defined her worth. She rejected the victim role because she understood something essential. Even pain had a purpose. Even frustration could be a teacher. Suffering wasn't something to avoid, but something to transform. And so little by little, she began walking the path of the witness. She learned to observe her emotions without judging or dramatizing them, to hold her sadness without masking it with pride or turning it into anger, to honor her desire for closeness without making it into a chain, to look at her impulse to please, and instead of denying it, to consciously deactivate it. This didn't make her cold or indifferent. It made her present, centered, deeply connected to her truth. There was a quiet strength in her new way of being, a dignity that didn't need to shout to be affirmed, a calm that didn't depend on the other's actions. That serenity wasn't indifference, it was emotional mastery. And that changed everything, because the cold man was no longer an enemy or emotional executioner. He was simply a mirror, a stage where she could see herself more clearly. And by no longer taking him personally, she stopped fighting his behavior, stopped waiting, stopped negotiating affection through overgiving. In that non-action, her true freedom began, not because he became more loving, but because she no longer needed his warmth to feel worthy of love. By observing her emotions instead of acting from them, something deep began to emerge within her. It wasn't a loud revelation or an explosive epiphany. It was a quiet understanding, like a whisper from the soul. Everything she was looking for outside already existed within her. And that's when her transformation began. His silence no longer led her into the abyss. It led her to her center. What she once interpreted as rejection, she now saw as an opportunity to deepen her relationship with herself. That anxious wait for a message became a call to listen to herself, to tend to her need for love, not with anxiety but with presence. Every emotion that used to overwhelm her became a portal, a threshold into her own self. In Jungian psychology, the self is the central core of the psyche, the balance point between the conscious and the unconscious, the totality of being. And to approach it, one must pass through the fragments, the traumas, the patterns, the unresolved desires. That's exactly what this relationship had awakened in her. Not a romantic tale, but an invitation to reunite with her essence. So she stopped seeking strategies. She stopped thinking about how to make him come closer. She no longer analyzed every word, every gesture, every space. She no longer tried to understand him, because she had understood something far more important, that her own energy was too valuable to orbit around an absence. She began to ask herself, what is this bond showing me about myself? What parts of me have I forgotten to inhabit? What have I been giving up out of fear of losing? And the answers came. She had abandoned her creativity, her joy, her body, her friendships. She had shifted her center toward him, not because he demanded it, but because unconsciously she had returned to that old pattern of compensating with affection for what was not reciprocated. But now she was awake. And that awakening didn't mean cutting everything off or ceasing to feel. It meant holding her energy, honoring her dignity, and understanding that giving space wasn't a tactic to provoke interest. It was a sacred act of self-love. She wasn't pushing him away to see if he would return. She was choosing to withdraw emotionally to return to herself. It's easy to confuse silence with disinterest, but for her, silence became a temple, a place to listen, to reorganize her inner world, to reconnect with what truly made her feel alive, her art, her body, her purpose. And there, in the midst of emotional chaos, she began to bloom. She rediscovered passions she had forgotten. She reconnected with her sensuality, not as a tool of seduction, but as an expression of life. She began to write, to create, to move freely. What had once been grief had now become rebirth, and she understood something that changed her way of loving forever. Depending on another's emotional response is a way of giving your soul in exchange for crumbs. And she was no longer willing to do that. Her worth didn't rise or fall based on how much attention she received. She wasn't more deserving because he replied quickly, nor less valuable because he didn't know how to hold her. She was whole, complete. And even if it hurt, she now knew that love not offered freely is not worth chasing. From this awareness, she chose to stop forcing closeness. Not because she no longer felt anything, but because she loved herself enough not to insist on what didn't flow. She chose not to chase, not to beg, not to plead, and that didn't make her cold, it made her sovereign. This inner change was visible. Her energy became clearer, more grounded. She no longer vibrated with the anxiety of, does he love me or not? but with the serenity of "I choose myself, and that is enough." While many around her still believed that maturity meant insisting and having endless conversations, she'd come to understand that sometimes the greatest maturity lies in silence, in letting each person meet themselves without pressure, without manipulation, without drama. And if he ever came back, it would be from a different place, not out of obligation, not from guilt, not from fear of losing her, but from true recognition, from a deep resonance. But if he didn't, that was okay too, because she had come back to herself, and that was worth more than any answered message. There is a vast difference between giving space as a strategy and giving space out of self-love. One is born from fear, the other from emotional maturity. She understood this after her process of introspection. She chose not to force closeness, and she didn't do it so he would miss her or to regain power. She did it because her inner dignity whispered, "Do not betray yourself for love." For years she had confused presence with worth. She thought that if she just tried a little harder, showed more sweetness, more understanding, more devotion, he would eventually open his heart. But over time, she realized that hearts don't open through pressure or emotional intensity. They open through resonance, and if that resonance wasn't there, forcing it was a form of self-abandonment. So she allowed herself to let go, not with resentment, but with acceptance. She realized that her energy was sacred and that she could no longer keep offering it to a place that didn't hold it. It wasn't coldness. It was mature love. Love that knows how to step back when the other isn't ready. Love that doesn't need to punish or manipulate, just honor its own truth. She didn't make a scene. She didn't issue complaints or slam the door in anger. She simply stopped insisting. And in that silence, without drama, without ultimatums, without bitterness, lived the strength of a woman who no longer needed to convince anyone of her worth. Many people believe that emotional maturity is saying everything, having the final conversation, expressing every feeling. But she had learned that sometimes true maturity is knowing when there's nothing left to say, when words are unnecessary and energy speaks louder. And her energy no longer asked for attention, it asked for peace. That decision not to chase wasn't a tactic to provoke a response. It was an act of respect for her own process. She knew that the other person was also moved by unconscious forces, and she respected that, not for him, but for herself. Because she understood that pressuring meant violating not only her own inner rhythm, but his as well. And there, in that act of non-interference, a new way of loving was born, a cleaner, clearer, freer kind of love. Because real love doesn't try to control, convince, or conquer. Real love observes, recognizes, and chooses from fullness. And that's what she had achieved, fullness. Not the absence of desire, but the presence of boundaries. Not the denial of the bond, but the acceptance of its form and its limit. And from that acceptance, she chose to let go. For years, she had confused presence with worth. She thought that if she just tried a little harder, showed more sweetness, more understanding, more devotion, he would eventually open his heart. But over time, she realized that hearts don't open through pressure or emotional intensity, they open through resonance. And if that resonance wasn't there, forcing it was a form of self-abandonment. So she allowed herself to let go, not out of contempt, but from acceptance. She understood that her energy was sacred and that she could no longer invest it in a place that couldn't hold it. It wasn't coldness, it was mature love. Love that knows how to step away when the other isn't ready. Love that doesn't need to punish or manipulate, only to honor its truth. She didn't make a scene. She didn't throw accusations or slam the door in anger. She simply stopped insisting. And in that silence, without drama, without ultimatums, without resentment, lived the strength of a woman who no longer needed to convince anyone of her worth. Many people believe emotional maturity means saying everything, having the final conversation, expressing every feeling. But she learned that sometimes true maturity is knowing when there's nothing left to say, when words are unnecessary and energy says it all. And her energy no longer asked for attention, it asked for peace. And not just any kind of peace, an inner peace that was non-negotiable, a peace that came from choosing with clarity, without rehearsing excuses or seeking external explanations. Emotional maturity wasn't about holding back tears. It was about crying them without losing oneself. It wasn't about suppressing desire. It was about recognizing it without submitting to it. That decision not to chase wasn't a tactic to get a response. It was an act of respect for her own process. She knew the other was also moved by unconscious forces, and she respected that, not for him, but for herself, because she understood that to pressure was to violate not only her own inner rhythm, but his as well. And there, in that act of non-interference, a new way of loving was born, a love that was cleaner, clearer, freer, more conscious. Because real love does not try to control, convince, or conquer. Real love observes, recognizes, and chooses from fullness. And that is what she had achieved, fullness. Not the absence of desire, but the presence of boundaries, not the denial of the bond, but the acceptance of its shape and its limits. She understood that not all connections are meant to last, and that honoring that limit was part of respecting life itself. Letting go wasn't a loss, it was a declaration, a radical affirmation of her new identity. She was no longer the woman waiting to be chosen. She was the woman who chose herself, even when that meant walking away. And from that acceptance, she chose to let go, not because she gave up, but because she finally understood that her soul was not made to beg for love, but to expand in freedom. For a long time, she had projected onto men qualities she had not yet cultivated within herself. She admired their confidence, their decisiveness, their clarity of direction. She felt that in the presence of a strong man, she found a kind of containment she didn't know how to give herself. And unknowingly, this placed her in an unequal position, waiting for the other to be what she didn't allow herself to be. Carl Jung called this inner figure the animus, the masculine part of the feminine unconscious, a set of energies that have nothing to do with gender but with psychic functions, firmness, logic, direction, autonomy. And when these qualities are not integrated, they are projected, they are sought outside, idealized. She had done this. She saw in that cold man someone strong, centered, unshakable. She confused his distance with self-control, his lack of response with depth, his ambiguity with mystery. But now she saw him with new eyes. What she admired was not him. It was the part of herself that had not yet awakened. And with that realization, something changed forever. Instead of continuing to hope that he would become the ideal man, she began to become her own center, to develop her inner direction, to stop doubting every step, to make decisions without fear of being wrong, to trust not only her intuition, but also her reason. She stopped looking to him for the stability she could build on her own. Integrating the animus was not a mental process. It meant embodying the qualities she had previously outsourced, taking her planner and organizing her life, choosing where to go without needing anyone's approval, setting boundaries without feeling guilty, speaking clearly without fearing she was too intense or too direct, discovering that her voice could also hold space. And that gave her power back. She no longer idealized. She no longer saw potential where there was only inconsistency. She no longer believed she could heal someone with love, because she now knew love does not save those who do not want to be saved. And that projection is a form of abandonment. Abandoning oneself in order to fill reality with fantasies one is not ready to accept. She remembered how many times she had said, "He has so much inside, he just needs someone to help him open up." Now she heard it as an echo of her former self. Because a woman who has integrated her animus does not rescue. She chooses, and she chooses from reality, not from need. From this new awareness, she began to walk differently, to see differently, no longer from lack, but from sovereignty. She no longer needed him to be the leader, because now she was her own guide. Her presence became firmer, clearer, more complete. This didn't mean she hardened or rejected the masculine. It meant she no longer depended on it to feel it. She had integrated it, she had embodied it. She understood that true containment doesn't come from another body, but from the capacity to hold oneself, to have inner structure. And so, by no longer seeking it outside, she stopped settling for the bare minimum. The animus became an ally, an inner companion that gave her direction, protection, structure. And from there, from this fusion of the feminine and masculine in balance, she could see men without projecting, without demanding, without building illusions. She could see them as they truly were and choose accordingly. She no longer needed to idealize. She no longer needed to fill the gaps in reality with fantasy. And that was freedom. One of the greatest acts of love she learned was to release control. And it wasn't easy because control had been her shield, her way of feeling safe. Since childhood, she had believed that if she anticipated everything, managed every detail, pleased everyone, she could avoid the pain of rejection. But now, in her emotional adulthood, she understood that this need for control was actually a mask for fear. With this man, control didn't work. She couldn't predict him. She couldn't change him. She couldn't bring him closer with affection or push him away with indifference. And that uncertain ground, instead of destroying her, transformed her. Because when control collapses, the truth appears. And her truth was clear. The time had come to let go. Let go of the expectation. Let go of the illusion. Let go of the need for a concrete answer. She understood that not knowing is also an answer. That not insisting is also a form of love. Love for herself, love for reality, love for the timing of the unconscious, which cannot be rushed or forced without harm. And by letting go, she became free. She stopped pushing. She stopped imagining possible futures. She stopped writing internal dialogues with him as the protagonist. She allowed herself to live in the present, to feel what was without anticipating what might be. She stopped holding up relationships that couldn't hold themselves. She stopped doing the emotional work that belonged to the other. That didn't mean indifference, it meant maturity. A maturity that distinguishes between the desire for connection and the need for symbiosis, that knows wanting to share life is not the same as needing someone to exist, that understands love is not fusion, it is meeting in wholeness. She understood that being emotionally available does not mean being available to be drained, that her energy is a sacred resource, that not everything that feels intense is love, and not everything that seems deep is real. And that clarity was a lighthouse. She stopped romanticizing emotional absence, stopped justifying prolonged distance, stopped believing that lack of commitment was a complex love language. She began to read facts, not interpretations, to listen to energy, not words, and when something didn't flow, she simply let it go. She recognized when her psychic energy was being drained. She no longer justified disinterest as personal processes. She no longer disguised abandonment as emotional space. She knew we all have internal timing, but she also knew how to recognize when that timing was just an excuse. And her intuition, which she had learned to trust, no longer needed external confirmation. Surrender was not a defeat. It was a profound act of wisdom. Because she understood that it wasn't her task to teach him how to love, to awaken him, or to wait for him. Her only task was to care for herself, to protect her energy, to choose spaces where she could bloom, not wither. Instead of trying to be the woman who would change him, she chose to be the woman who does not sacrifice herself to be seen, who does not lose herself to be loved, who does not deny herself to be accepted, because she had learned that every time she forced what didn't flow, she lost a piece of herself. And losing herself was no longer an option. Not all men are ready to hold the emotional depth that a conscious woman embodies, and she understood that, not as judgment, but as acceptance. Not as rejection, but as reality. For a long time, she believed that if she was loving enough, present enough, radiant enough, he would see her worth. But the truth is, not everyone is ready to see. Because seeing requires responsibility. It means letting go of emotional avoidance. It means entering the connection from a vulnerable, honest, and present place. And not everyone is ready for that. When she understood this, she didn't get angry. She didn't shut down. She didn't harden her heart. She simply accepted. Accepted that it wasn't a lack of love, it was a lack of awareness. That it wasn't that she didn't deserve, it was that he couldn't give what he hadn't cultivated within himself. That her emotional intensity wasn't too much, it simply didn't resonate with someone still living in fear of real commitment. And from that understanding, she chose to walk away. Not as punishment, not as manipulation, not as a "I'll leave so you'll come back," but as an affirmation of her inner worth, as a radical decision to keep growing, even if that meant letting go of a connection that had touched her deeply. Her goodbye was silent but powerful. She didn't need dramatic explanations or emotional declarations. She didn't ask for a final conversation. She simply walked away with serenity, because she had realized that true closure isn't given by the other. It comes from the clarity of one's own awareness. And her awareness was clear. This wasn't about him. It was about returning to herself. She understood that this relationship wasn't a mistake. It was a mirror. A precise reflection of the parts of herself that needed to be seen, healed, and loved. That cold man had been the trigger, the catalyst, the spark that ignited an internal revolution. But the real encounter wasn't with him, it was with herself, with the woman she had forgotten while trying to be chosen, with the voice she had silenced to avoid discomfort, with the desires she had postponed to adapt, with the strength she had put to sleep in search of approval. And now that she had reconnected with that woman, she knew she would never lose herself for love again, that she would never again lower her vibration to hold someone else up, that her path was not one of waiting, but one of expansion. She thanked the bond, she thanked the lessons, she even thanked the pain, because without that story, she wouldn't have remembered who she was, and who she was worth more than any external validation. The woman now breathing in front of the mirror was no longer the same. She was more whole, more conscious, more sovereign. And from that place, she understood that not every connection is meant to stay. Some connections come only to awaken us, and that doesn't make them any less important. On the contrary, it makes them initiatory. In the end, she understood that true love doesn't always come from the outside. Sometimes it arrives the moment we fully choose ourselves, when we choose our peace, our dignity, our authenticity, and then, effortlessly, we attract relationships that resonate on that same frequency. She closed that chapter with gratitude, not with bitterness, with growth, not with resentment, with self-love, not with emptiness. And as she did, she sealed it with a phrase that became her mantra, her compass, her deepest truth. It was never about him. It was always about returning to me.